Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to the Faulkner and August 2020 read-along of The Sound and the Fury. Today my video will be discussing Section 3 of The Sound and the Fury, and I just forgot the date for Section 3 of The Sound and the Fury, but it's kind of like the chapter title. There we go, April the 6th, 1928. Just to put that out there and make sure we're all in the same place. So Section 3 is Jason's section, and I'm sure you've picked up on this by now, and you probably picked up on it sooner, that essentially the story of The Sound and the Fury is the story of Caddy Compson as told by her three brothers. Her three brothers who are all in their own way obsessed with Caddy. Benji because he loves her and she loves him. And he gives meaning to her life. Quentin, because he identifies Caddy in some kind of psychosexual way with a family honor, and maybe he's has an incestuous interest in her as well. And then Jason is obsessed with her because he resents her so much for the damage that he thinks that she has done to his life. So I want to start off talking about the obvious here, and that's talking about Jason himself. I'm sorry, I'm reading from my notes. I'm going to put him here, so maybe I can make a little more eye contact if they're over there. So I just kind of want to talk about Jason's character traits and evil. In our Voxer discussion, I just made the blanket statement that Jason sucks. Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics has promised to make Jason more sympathetic, and I look forward to his video because I have almost no sympathy for Jason Compson. He is what my mother and grandmother just referred to as cussed. He's just mean, and he's mean for no other reasons than meanness gives him pleasure in some kind of way. He does various things that are just small acts of cruelty and meanness, and large acts of cruelty and meanness that are just, I think, really revealing of his character. He wants to control Quentin. He believes he can control Quentin using violence and intimidation, and he's wrong. And you'll find out Jason Compson is wrong about lots of things. He's constantly threatening violence but rarely carrying it out, which also makes him look foolish. He is everything he accuses other people of doing and of being. He's lazy. For all his talk about, having to go to work and liking to go to work, the truth of the matter is he's lazy. He's not a good employee at the hardware store where he works. The hardware store owner more or less employed him and went into a business arrangement with Jason's mother just to give him a job, and tolerates him primarily because of his respect for Jason's mother. Jason is a fool. He's foolish with his money. He invests money in things he doesn't understand, in the stock market, in the cotton market, and he loses that money. When he tries to, force Quentin to behave, he makes a fool of himself by chasing after her and whatever man she's gone off with out into the woods, and they humiliate him by letting the air out of his tires. He's immoral. He accuses Caddy and Quentin of being immoral, but he spends his time sexually with a prostitute in Memphis. He is full of resentments, and those resentments really kind of drive him in all kinds of ways. I think this will be the chapter which I read the most quotes. So this is Jason essentially running down what he sees as his problems and the problems he has to deal with, but also expressing his resentment of the family. And there I was, without any hat, looking like I was crazy too, like a man would naturally think one of them is crazy and another one drowned himself and the other one was turned out into the street by her husband. What's the reason the rest of them are not crazy too? All the time I could see them watching me like a hawk, waiting for a chance to say, well, I'm not surprised. I expected it all the time. The whole family's crazy. Selling land to send him to Harvard and paying taxes to support a state university all the time that I never saw except twice at a baseball game, and not letting her daughter's names be spoken on the place until after a while. Father couldn't even come down to town anymore, but just sat there all day with a decanter. I could see the bottom of his nightshirt and his bare legs and hear the decanter clinking until finally TP had to pour it for him, and she says, you have no respect for your father's memory. And I says, I don't know why. It's sure preserved well enough to last and he essentially just runs down all the issues: his sister's promiscuity, his brother getting a chance to go to Harvard, the selling of land to help Quentin, his father's drinking, his brother's mental handicap. He just runs through all of it. So just to kind of go back over a lot of those things, he resents Quentin for getting the education. He resents Caddy for not getting him the job. When Caddy leaves her husband, Herbert Head, Jason loses his chance to have a job as a banker. He resents Benji for kind of tying him down and becoming a responsibility, and for his mental handicap. He resents his father's drinking. He resents his mother for loving him the most and telling him how great he is, and then having to be reminded of his actual circumstance. He resents Dilsey and the other African Americans who work around the Compson place because he feels like he has to support them. He resents his boss because he has to work there, and his boss kind of has this piece of knowledge his boss has about Jason that he holds over his head. He essentially blames others for his problems. He behaves in incredibly evil ways. I think the most clear sign of evil is when he more or less gets Caddy to give him $100 for that brief glimpse of Quentin as they go by in a carriage, where literally she got no time. She just got to see the baby, and he uses that, and he uses this promise of getting to see Quentin to extort more money from her, which he steals. He steals money from Caddy, he steals money from his mother, and he uses that money to invest. He enjoys humiliating Quentin in any way he can, and there's, Jack and I talked about this, there's kind of, I think, some kind of a sexual pleasure almost that Jason gets from humiliating Quentin. He drags her out of the room, and her kimono comes open, and he's more or less exposed her. He wants to catch her in the act with a man that he chased out in the woods. What kind of an uncle wants to catch his niece in the sex act other than to humiliate her in that way? At dinner near the end of the section, he keeps offering her another piece of meat and asking her if she's had another piece of meat. In today's terms, I think you can see the kind of crude sexuality of that. I'm not sure that's what Faulkner had in mind. I think what Faulkner is talking about here is treating her like an animal. Speaking of animals, Jason equates Caddy, his sister's sexual behavior, and Quentin, his niece's sexual behavior, with African Americans who he says have to, can't even go to a decent house and have their sexual relationships, have to do it out in the woods or in the field somewhere, which he equates with kind of being like animals. He's incredibly racist. He's an anti-Semitic. I mean, there's almost nothing you can say, I think, that's positive about Jason. And I think some of the best clues to Jason's characters come from the African American characters in this section who have to interact with Jason. Now, what I will say, is just based on my experience of reading Faulkner, is that oftentimes Faulkner uses African American characters to reveal truths about his white characters, which, through their telling of the story or from their point of view, are oftentimes obscured, and oftentimes they just come in these kind of fairly quick moments. And so most of the moments I'm talking about here have to do with Dilsey telling Jason something directly, or Job, the African American man who works at the hardware store with Jason, and both kind of take their digs at him. Dilsey directly, and Job more indirectly. So in the scene where Jason is threatening to beat Quentin, Dilsey gets in the middle and says, "Hit me." And Jason says, "You think I won't?" And she says, "I don't put no devilment beyond you." Well, that is early on, really, in the section, in the chapter. And as you'll learn, she's absolutely right. There's almost no devilment, almost no evil that Jason won't get up to. So later on in the section, when Dilsey and Jason are having another encounter involving his mother and involving Dilsey's allowing Caddy in the house to see Quentin when she was a baby, Jason confronts her and threatens her and explains, there's this whole scene about why he doesn't want that to take place. Dilsey looks at him and says, "You's a cold man, Jason, if man you is," she says. I thank the Lord I got more heart than that, even if it is black. So again, I'm reading the language that Faulkner has here, but essentially she says, you're cold, I'm not sure you're even a man, I'm happy I have more heart, even if I'm black, even if I'm African American, I have more heart than you, a white person, and more compassion, which I think is a very strong statement again, and intentionally used by Faulkner here to point out the humanity of Dilsey, the African American character, and the inhumanity of Jason, which must have been incredibly galling to a racist like Jason, as well as this scene then with Job. Jason, by the way, moves around a lot in this section. He's at the hardware store, he's at home, he's out in the woods looking for Quentin, he's all over the place. But this is the part where he has gone back to the hardware store and he's talking to Job, who's supposed to be getting these, what are they, combines ready? Anyway, so a musical show has come to town. That's where Quentin is picked up with this other man, and Jason is talking about how everybody's wasting their money by going. 2 bits, hell, I says, that don't begin it. How about the dime and 15 cents you'll spend for a damn 2-cent box of candy or something? How about the time you're wasting right now listening to that band? Again, reading in the language that Faulkner has put in the mouth of Job, he says, that's the truth. He says, well, if I live 12 night, it's gonna be 2 bits mo they taken out of town. That's show. In other words, he's saying, if I live till it gets dark when the show starts, I'm gonna go give him my 2 bits as well. Jason says, then you're a fool. And Job says, well, he says, I don't dispute that neither. If that is a crime, all chain gangs wouldn't be black. In other words, he's saying that, foolish behavior isn't confined to African Americans, and specifically since he's saying that to Jason, he's also more or less calling Jason a fool. He does that again later in far more direct terms. So here again is a confrontation between Jason and Job at work. Jason says, like hell you haven't. You've been away from here since 3 o'clock. Mr. Earl just back here looking for you. I've been tending to my business, he says. Mr. Earl knows where I've been. You can fool him, I says. I won't tell on you. Then he's the onliest man here I'd try to fool, he says. What I want to waste my time fooling a man who don't care whether I sees him Saturday night or not. I won't try to fool you, he says. You too smart for me. Yes, sir, he says, looking busy as hell, putting 5 or 6 little packages into the wagon. You's too smart for me. Ain't a man in this town can keep up with you for smartness. You fools a man what's so smart he can't even keep up with himself, he says, getting in the wagon and unwrapping the reins. Who's that? I says. That's Mr. Jason Compson. So Job's just pointed out that Jason is a fool and that he is fooling himself. And he does this in such a clever way by initially, and probably in a way Jason may not ever pick up on, praising Jason's intelligence and then saying the only person who can fool him is himself, which then means that Jason is in fact a fool. So Jason is the character who dominates this section because he's the character more or less narrating this section. It's from his point of view. But we also learn a lot. We learn some things about other characters, including Quentin, his niece Quentin. And I'm just going to say Quentin is pretty awful. Quentin is not someone I would want to necessarily have living in my house. She's bratty, she's rebellious, she's selfish. She's angry all the time. In a way, having raised 2 teenagers, I've never seen a teenager behave that way. I think Quentin is justified, perhaps, in the way that she is. She says she's living in hell, and I believe for her it is. She's been raised without a mother by a grandmother who we've already seen, that Caroline Compson is a bad parent. She has an uncle who is resentful of her for who she is and for what her mother did, who takes out his resentment on her. And in some ways, she is just following the path her mother took towards independence. She is breaking free of Jason by being promiscuous, as Caddy was breaking free of her family through her promiscuity. Caroline Compson, the mother, is also, I think we learn a lot more about Caroline Compson here, and exactly how resentful she is, and that a fair amount of Jason's resentment for the rest of his family comes from his mother. So I'll read a quote from his mom here as well. So in talking to Jason, Caroline Compson, his mother, says, "They deliberately shut me out of their lives," she says. "It was always her and Quentin. They were always conspiring against me, against you too, though you were too young to realize it." I think Jason realized it. "They were always looking on you and me as outsiders, like they did your Uncle Maury. I always told your father that they were allowed too much freedom, to be together too much. When Quentin started school, we had to let her go next year so she could be with him. She couldn't bear for any of you to do anything she couldn't. It was vanity in her, vanity and false pride. And then when her troubles began, I knew that Quentin would feel that he had to do something just as bad, but I didn't believe he would have been so selfish as to. I didn't dream that he..." So here she's just running down her list of resentments against her own daughter and against her husband. For looking down, from her point of view, on the Bascom family, looking down on Maury and Jason and her, and allowing too much freedom to Quentin and Caddy. By the way, there's some interesting information here. Again, just going back to the Quentin-Caddy relationship from the last section, clearly Caddy wants to be with Quentin, that she has this desire to be with him, and that they are incredibly close. And I'll circle back to this here again later. But Mrs. Compson is also obsessed with the difference between the Compsons and the Bascoms. She was a Bascom before she married Jason Compson. The third, she's obsessed there. She's foolish. She always trusts the wrong people. She trusts Jason. He steals from her. She trusts Maury. He steals from her. She trusts Quentin. She, debases her grandmother. She has a lot of false moralizing. She won't take money from Caddy because Caddy's a fallen woman, but, Mrs. Compson is far from pure. As a matter of fact, several times she talks about Benji being kind of a curse for the sins that she's committed, and she's still a bad parent. It's in this section that we learn that Mrs. Compson is actually addicted to patent medicines, something which Jason kind of mentions, that she spends a fortune on these patent medicines. I'm sure you're aware that patent medicines in the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century were essentially unregulated by the United States government. They contained high amounts of alcohol, and worse, sometimes they contained laudanum, which is a derivative of opium, and they were quite addictive. And doctors prescribed these patent medicines oftentimes to middle-class women who complained about their nerves or ill health, and these women became addicted, and they more or less just withdrew to their bedrooms, and they were always having nerves and always having headaches. And if you notice, this is exactly what we know about Mrs. Compson. So we get kind of a clear idea of the nightmare that exists inside the Compson home in 1928, exactly how bad things are. So now let me circle back to the thing which kind of dominates the discussion of the second section, of the Quentin section, and that is this topic of incest. So in this Jason section, the section I'm talking about now, we really don't see this discussion of incest between Quentin and Caddy in any direct way, but to me, and this is my own personal theory, and it could be completely wrong, but I do think it's interesting. To me, this section brings up several questions, and it forced me to think about this issue of incest between Quentin and Caddy. So let's just go ahead and accept that Quentin and Caddy feel very close to one another, and there may in fact be some mutual attraction between them. That's a possibility based on what we learned from Section 2. But in Section 2, Quentin proposes that he claimed that he's forced himself on Caddy and committed incest as a way of saving the family reputation, that this would save the family reputation from Caddy's promiscuity and her unwanted pregnancy. That is a weird thing to think. To think that doing something worse would distract from the thing that diminished the family honor is weird, and it brings up a couple things. Either, number one, incest was so common in the South, and maybe it was, that this would distract. But if it was so common, would it be bad enough to... Anyway. But the other thing it brings up is, to me, why is this what Quentin thinks? Does he have an example of incest, or to believe he has an example of incest, that he's modeling, in a sense, his behavior on. Has there been incest in his own family? And that's kind of where I wanted to start talking about this again, and start talking about the possibility of an incestuous relationship between Uncle Maury and Caroline Compson, between Uncle Maury and the mother of the Compson children. And again, like I say, this is just a theory. I have seen it discussed in a few places because I've looked, but this is kind of just a theory. So there are two things I want to talk about in this. One is the decision to change Benji's name. So I've looked this up, and various sources, I think, inaccurately say that Caroline Compson changed Benji's name because, number one, either they found out that he was mentally handicapped when he was 5, and she didn't want her son, who was mentally handicapped, to be named after her brother, who she liked and admired. You know, that I suppose that's an answer, but I think there's every indication the family knew that Benji was mentally impaired long before the age of 5. There's also the idea that they changed his name because they were ashamed that Uncle Maury was involved in an affair with Mrs. Patterson. But, you know, I think we have a clear indication that Mr. Compson knew about Maury's character, and maybe, you know, it's possible that Caroline Compson, née Bascom, didn't know before this point. But that still seems like something that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. That, you know, Caroline Compson doesn't punish or in any way disassociate herself from her brother, except for in this one area. So I just suggest that perhaps there's something about this incident with Mrs. Patterson and Uncle Maury that explains maybe why Caroline Compson decided to change Benji's name from Maury to Benji. And that has to do with Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson yells and screams and calls Benji an idiot. This is, I think, the first time that someone outside the Compson family or household has recognized that Benji is mentally impaired. And it's only when it's recognized outside the family that Mrs. Compson decides she needs to change his name. To change Benji's name from Maury, to change his name from her brother's name to a different name. So why doesn't she want her brother Maury associated with Benji's mental impairment? Could it be that Benji is the product of an incestuous relationship between Maury and Mrs. Compson, and that she's afraid that people will realize this is true because of his mental his mental impairment, you know, which is rumored to be one of the byproducts of incestuous relationships? Is she trying to hide or break that connection by changing the name? I think it's possible. You know, it's important to note that Maury lives in the house with the Compsons, that he is supported by Jason Compson, and that he remains close to Caroline Compson. There's a whole scene when Jason Compson's at Jason Compson's funeral where he's holding her hand and he's comforting her, which seems a little potentially unbrotherly in that situation. So, you know, the opportunity definitely does exist. Would Quentin have become aware of this? Possibly, by listening to and talking to his father. Why does his father have such a dim view of marriage and women unless his own marriage has unraveled and his own marriage and his own ideas about his own wife have been seriously diminished? And, you know, what causes then Jason Compson III to drink? What causes Caroline Bascom Compson to become addicted to patent medicines? Why do both of them seek oblivion? Why do they have an increasingly confrontational relationship? And then, you know, my final piece of evidence would be that Caroline Bascom Compson, is constantly telling Jason that he's not really a Compson. And this is an idea that Jason has accepted. So I have several quotes about that. So in my book, on page 208, Mrs. Compson, the mother, says, "I know you have to slave your life away for us," she says. "You know if I had my way, you'd have an office of your own to go to in hours that became a Bascom, because you are a Bascom, despite your name. I know that if your father could have foreseen," and then she just breaks off. So she mentioned Jason's father here, but she mentioned it after saying he's a Bascom, and not a Compson. So is she implying that Jason's father is actually Maury, and that if Maury could have foreseen what would have happened to their son, that he would have done things differently? I don't know. At least a question. Jason then here also, in another kind of his recitation against his resentments against his family, also implies something like that. So Jason, and this is on the occasion of him remembering back to his father, Jason Compson III's funeral, he said, "Like I say, if he had to sell something to send Quentin to Harvard, we'd all been a damn sight better off if he'd sold that sideboard and bought himself a one-arm straitjacket with part of the money. I reckon the reason all the Compson gave out before it got to me, like Mother says, is that he drank it up." So this is a direct shot that Jason Compson IV is taking at his dead father, Jason Compson III, suggesting that he should have sold a sideboard where he kept his whiskey, and he should have had a one-arm straitjacket to hold his arm down so he couldn't drink, and that drink had used up all the Compson. So, there is a connection between alcoholism and impotence. Maybe that is what Jason is here implying, but I just think, again, it's interesting they're talking about Jason not really being a Compson. Another quote where Mrs. Compson is talking about Jason, she says, "You're my only hope," she says. "Every night I thank God for you. While we were waiting there for them to start," she says, "thank God if he had to be taken too, it's you left me and not Quentin. Thank God you are not a Compson, because all I have left now is you and Maury." So again, she says that Jason is not a Compson, and that she's happy that if she had to be left with one son, it's Jason, who's not the Compson, instead of Quentin, who is the Compson. So again, later she says, "Yes," she says, "we Bascoms need nobody's charity, certainly not that of a fallen woman." So here she's talking about Caddy as a fallen woman, and she is saying we Bascoms, including Jason and her. Again, separating the Compsons from the Bascoms. And then this last thing I want to point out to you has to do with her comparing Jason to Maury. And she's talking about, Jason trying to not let Jason have control over Quentin because he's afraid he'd be too violent. And she said, "You'd be too brutal with her." She says, "You have your Uncle Maury's temper." So she essentially is equating his temper with his Uncle Maury. She's comparing him to Maury. And are there comparisons to be made between Maury Bascom and Jason Compson? Well, yes. They both, neither one ever gets married. Both enter into affairs. Jason with a prostitute, I guess. I assume she's a prostitute. And Maury with a married woman. They both take advantage of their sisters. They both steal money from their sisters. They both are always scheming in ways to get rich quick. They are very similar people. Anyway, this whole idea that there is an incestuous relationship between Maury Bascom and his sister, Caroline Compson Bascom, is of course just a theory, but I'll point out to you that birth order-wise it makes sense. So remember that Mrs. Compson, the mother, draws the line between Compsons and Bascoms, between Caddy and Jason. So birth order-wise, the kids are Quentin, who she considers to be a Compson, Caddy, who she considers to be a Compson, and then next is Jason, who she considers to be a Bascom, and then Benji, who is mentally impaired. Anyway, that's just my theory about incest. I hope you enjoyed reading this section. This is the one that's kind of a relief because it reads more straightforwardly than the other sections, by the way, which indicates that Jason is not really an introspective, inward-thinking person, which he's certainly not. Which makes him different from the other Compsons, who are always in their own heads. Anyway, those are just my theories. Love to see your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.